I'm Ed West. Robert and I worked together down here with some others on developing the history of the town. I think a number of you have not, at least I haven't seen you here. How many of you all have never been to one of these talks before?
Never been?
Yeah, never been. You have been occasionally, okay. Well, we're trying to develop accurate new history along with, working with what we already have. And one whole area that has taken a whole lot of time is developing the story of the black history in Summerville. And the primary reason is there's very little documentation before the Civil War of anything. And whatever we have is written by white people about the way they understood things. And so a whole lot of what we understand about black history comes from oral history prior to the Civil War. And gradually there's been a kind of a documentation of what's going on through the years. If you just think about what I'm saying right now, that history is basically the review of what happened to people in a society. That's what history is. And if we're not writing it down, then we have to go to secondary ways of figuring it out. When it's written down, by the way, the only thing we really know about it is what's preserved. A whole lot of stuff that's preserved is thrown away, or burned up, or stolen, or whatever happens to it. A whole lot of people, probably some in this room, say, well, I wish I had the letters of my great aunt, or something like that, but I don't know where they are now. And they're just gone. It's just gone. So we've been trying to dig out history of the black neighborhoods of Summerville for a long time. What Robert's going to tell you today, Robert's a high school history teacher and is highly qualified to talk to you all. And what we're talking about today is something I've wanted to talk about for years, but I think he's far more qualified to talk about it because there's just a way of figuring out what's going on that if you're talking about black stuff, it's going to be easier for a black person to talk to a black person than for a white person to talk to a black person because it's the way it works. It does not change the story at all. It just means I'm just really glad you're doing it. I want to tell you one thing that I did today during the church hours, between 10 and 1. I was in church myself, but just before and just after what I was doing, I was going around the neighborhoods of Summerville to see where churches are. And it's really interesting to see where churches are south of the railroad tracks. There are, I counted 6 historically black churches south of the railroad tracks. There's a way of thinking the railroad tracks divide us, but actually they don't do it much. They don't divide us much, which is really good. And this comes from our history, that we have historically been this way. I'm talking about from antebellum's pre-Civil War days. And Robert's going to talk about this. And I think the churches have a lot to say a lot about our history if you just look at where they are. The prominent church on Central Avenue, just before you get to the little bridge across the street from Timrod Library, is the Epiphany. That's a Reformed Episcopal church. It's historically black, but today it's a fairly integrated congregation. The other historically black church over there is called Pengelly Chapel, which is on the campus of the Reformed Episcopal Seminary on South Main Street. That's a historically black seminary, and the seminarians go and use Pengelly Chapel. Routinely they use it for worship services. The Wesley Methodist Church, back up in the little cul-de-sac beside this, the First Baptist Church, used to be called St. Joseph's, and it comes from the 1870s. The whole face of it looks modern, but the actual church has been covered by brick. And we can't see the original face of the church, but the original face is quite attractive, of Victorian wood. and it's a historically black church. The Bethel AME on South Main Street, a block beside the mortuary, may have been the first AME church established in South Carolina after Mother Magna, because the missionaries who came here in 1865 came to Summerville very quickly after they got to Charleston. And I'm pretty sure that the Bethel Church dates from that time. I don't really have that history, but I'm pretty sure it does. And I think that may have been the one that was established by the missionaries who came here. And then First Baptist is on Sumter Avenue, which is in the heart of the original village. So First Baptist was right after the Civil War, I think 1867. And then Central Baptist is tucked up in there in the middle of, it's about a block away from the original town hall on West Carolina, the Central Baptist. Very busy little church in the middle of a neighborhood that historically you would think was a white neighborhood. But all these things come from where people lived. They just lived around. And I was just talking to my neighbor. I live on Richardson Avenue. He literally has a slave quarters in his backyard. His family moved into the home in the 1890s. And he said as a boy he remembers a black woman lived in the slave quarters of his time. She, he knows, was associated with the family of 1890s who bought the home. That was his relatives who bought the home. She worked for them as a servant in the house, a cook or whatever, and she lived out there in those quarters. This is the way it works around Summerville. Is people live where they grew up, they live where they came from. And Robert's going to talk about these things today, and I hope we can all just listen to it and just learn from it, because there's a whole lot we can do with it. It's all yours.
Okay. I do miss Penn Village. She lived right next door to my grandparents. And as a matter of fact, she had a little cottage back there with an outhouse on that.
Good old-fashioned outhouse. Well, they were necessary. They were necessary. Thank you all for coming out here today. It's exciting to see you. We've been working on this one for a while. I've been anxious to get this one out. I really have. You ever have one of those subjects you're really passionate about? You really want to get it out? This one has been in my crawl for quite a while. And it was great that we finally got a chance to do this. And although Ed talked about the historic black neighborhoods, we're going to talk about all neighborhoods. We're going to talk about all of Summerville. We're going way back to how it really got started. So the first thing I have is a question for you. Raise your hand if you think you live in the original Summerville. You live today. Okay, there's a couple of hands. A couple of hands. Folks are nervous, like, I don't know. It sounds like a trick question, right? I'm not sure. Okay, so during this talk, you're going to find out. You're going to find out if you did indeed live in the original Summerville. So as this talk progresses, we'll find out what was old Summerville, what was new Summerville, how that all came about. This talk was originally shaped as a discussion about the forced separation of ethnic groups in historic Summerville. But once again, Summerville proved me wrong. Instead of forced separation and a history of intense Jim Crow segregation, I found a more moderate atmosphere of well-understood social lines and unusually diverse communities for the tumultuous period of that Jim Crow era. We're talking about the 1950s through the 1970s in America. You can imagine what that time was like. But as a true historian, you got to be willing to tell the story the way the evidence leads you. Not the way your preconceived thoughts of historic stereotypes can quickly take you. So as a child of the North, I'm from Philly. If y'all don't know, if you can't tell, I'm not a Southerner. We've been here since 2009 in Summerville. But being from Philly, I had these notions of the South and what it meant, what the South meant, okay? So to me, the South was this harsh, hateful environment where whites ruled over helpless blacks and no other ethnicities really played a part in any of the communities. Hey, just being honest with you, that was my mindset coming out here. And it was almost, I'm not gonna say proven true, but one of my first early adventures is my wife is big into recycling. So I had to find a recycling places before they started taking it from the house. So there's a recycling place on Latson Road. So I'm like, I'm gonna find this place. So I apparently drove by it, went around the back curve, and there was this ginormous Confederate flag. I said, we ain't recycling today. I turned around, took them cans right back home. You know, later on, like, okay, that was an oddity, but at the time, I'm like, yeah, just what I thought. Just what I thought. Now, that may have been true in some places, like Montgomery, Alabama, where my mother-in-law grew up. She has a lot of stories from her time as a child in Montgomery, but that doesn't mean that's what it's like here, right? So many of the stories of ironclad, segregation, Jim Crow created a stereotypical view that blanketed the entire South in darkness in the minds of many of us up north. Somehow, Summerville consistently shattered that stereotype. Not that Summerville was free from the ravages of Jim Crow. It was not. But my research suggests Summerville was much more accepting of diversity than many towns in America. And I'm not just talking about in the South. As I tell my students, we can't go by bad South, good North. No, that wasn't the truth. But quite often that's the narrative that we're fed, right? You got to do some reading and learning to find out that's not necessarily the truth. During one interview, I finally thought I had the information I needed to validate my preconceptions. In an interview with Mr. Sinclair Mack, former student and star athlete of Austin High School, 1959, who, by the way, made it clear that any real Summerville resident would only recognize the name Bozelmack. So I don't know if any of you knew him, but he goes by Bozelmack. I thought he had finally given me what I was expecting when he said something that actually ended up being a rather funny quote. He said, Summerville was very prejudiced. Okay, there it is. I got y'all now. Here we go. Buckle up. He's about to tell me something that was about his childhood, his mistreatment growing up in Summerville, how discrimination ran rampant. But that was not the full quote. The full quote says, Summerville was very prejudiced. But I don't think they knew what it meant. Because it was just a word to them, because a lot of things went on between black and white. Like, dang it! Thought I had something juicy. Blew that right out of the water. So interviews with longtime residents of this great community redirected my talk from a discussion of the pain and isolation of segregation to the communal spirit of acceptance and diversity. As many of you know from personal experience, it was not perfect. I did hear stories of separate entrances for white and blacks at certain places, like the doctor's office. But even those stories were absent of animosity or pain. But with a statement that today would offend me, but at that time seemed to work for them. An older black man said to me, and I quote, everyone knew their role. Everybody knew their place. So wherever you wanted to live was fine. I'm like, what? That don't sound like the South. That don't make any sense in my brain. But at the same time, that sounded too much to me like that more hateful statement you might hear today. Somebody tell me, know your place. Yeah, I wouldn't be with that today, right? Maybe for them. But that's not what this gentleman meant. He was communicating a social understanding that maintained the peace and dignity of all involved. An understanding that said, yes, racism exists in Summerville. Yes, there was the Ku Klux Klan, or a new term I learned recently, the Clavering. Anybody ever heard that term before? The Clavering. It was a white group that met in Summerville. They were the Klan, but their club was called, they were part of the Clavering. Never learned about that Let's dig a little bit deeper into that one. Maybe Dr. West can explain that one a little bit later.
Yeah.
He educated me on that one.
Went back when I was in the Klan, you know.
No, Dr. West was not in the Klan. All right, so yes, for the most part, blacks and whites were not next door neighbors, with a few exceptions on Main Street. But for the most part, these social barriers were not there to keep you down, but accepted as a way to maintain peace. Now, I am in no way saying I accept segregation to maintain peace. I'm more W.E.B. Du Bois than Booker T. Washington. If you understand those gentlemen, you understand what I mean. But what I am saying, I will not stand up here and tell historic Summerville that how you maintain peace and a sense of community during one of the worst social periods in American history was wrong. Not when the people at the bottom of that social ladder had nothing but joy and fondness in their hearts and fond memories of their childhood in Summerville. Sounds to me, Summerville, that you got it right, whatever that balance was. This discussion today is about the uniqueness of individual communities that made up the whole of the Summerville community. I want to highlight what I've learned about the geographic background and how ethnicity played a part. To fully understand Summerville, you must start long before the current borderlines were drawn. To fully understand, when asking where the white residents lived in Summerville, it was less about a specific neighborhood name and more about old Summerville versus new Summerville. Let me make one important clarification. When I say white people, I'm including the greater diaspora of Europeans, including Jewish Americans who resided in Summerville. For the most part, as with all ethnic groups, income levels played a much greater role in where they lived than did their ethnicity. That kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? As for Summerville, no matter how hard I tried, no one could tell me what truly is old Summerville versus new Summerville geographically. Just comments about how the atmosphere has changed. One example is how the police department in Summerville only consisted of a sheriff and a deputy in a 2-cell jailhouse. In case you don't know it, you're standing in there right now. You walk past that little jail cell. This was the jail for Summerville. This was the jailhouse back in the day. Or how the town shut down around 5 or 6 every night. But even that was the history of New Summerville. Until I turned my inquiry inward, meaning I asked the old folks like Dr. West, all about old Summerville versus new Summerville. Dr. West and Mr. Danny Hughes really came through. But here's one thing I did get about Summerville's history in my other interviews. The tea farm. Apparently the wealthiest citizens built homes on the old tea farm, formerly Dr. Shepard's Pinehurst Tea Plantation. Honorable mention also goes out to the Hagen and Woodlands areas as well, but nothing topped living on the old tea farm land as far as status. Think of it as the Beverly Hills of Summerville. If you can build a house out there, you made it. You were among the top folks around. When I asked the question, where did the affluent blacks live? I was told, and we need to remember this today, we got too many relatives. I was told affluent blacks didn't tell nobody they were affluent. So that question for him was impossible to answer, right? And y'all know what I'm talking about. The more you talk about being successful, the more cousins you get. So, in case any of my family watch this video, I'm broke. So a great example, though, of whites in a more modest area is one of our favorite historic Summerville residents, who was not considered wealthy until after his death. See, you know how to do it. And that'd be Mr. Saul Alexander. Mr. Alexander, a Jewish American, successful businessman, lived comfortably on Central Avenue and owned a dry goods store right here in Hutchinson Square. But nobody knew he was wealthy until he died and donated all that money to places like this. I'll talk more about that in a moment. While our multi-ethnic heroine, Catherine Kitty Springs, I say that because we still don't know the sister was. Cherokee, African, white. Her picture's upstairs if you want to check it out. To me, that's clearly a sister, but hey, I don't know. But she got along quite well here in Summerville. She lived West 2nd North Street and West Cedar Street in the heart of downtown Summerville. It was a very, very successful business owner. All right, let's get down and dirty. The original village of Summerville, 1830. Are you anywhere on that map? Where you live today? I'm gonna break it down a little bit further, see if we can find you in here. So as we dig deeper, to answer that once elusive question, what is the difference between Old Summerville and New Summerville? So I'm gonna use these maps provided by Danny Hughes here at the museum, and the explanations provided by our very own Dr. West. So on the left, Central Avenue was considered the end of Summerville. What is the difference between, in case you can't see there, this is Central Avenue. And as you see by this arrow, the railroad tracks are way that way. So that's not Summerville. This is Summerville in 1830. Right? Central Avenue was considered the border. This excluded everything that is to the right of St. Paul's Church. That's really how they designated things. If you're this side of St. Paul's, you ain't Summerville. If you're on that side, you're Summerville. It's going to be very clear why that is in just a moment. So they did not consider anything past St. Paul's Church to be part of Summerville. Yes, that means Hutchinson Square, and much of what we think of as the heart of Summerville today was not part of Old Summerville. It was not. The railroad company eventually owned all the property you see to the right. So you look on here, it says land of Thomas More here, and more importantly over here, land of Mr. Stewart. Land of Mr. Stewart. So the railroad company owned all that property to the right of where it says land of Mr. Stewart. The two areas that eventually merged into today's Summerville were separated by a very large body of water that was there. The map on the right shows a more detailed look at the land separated into parcels. So you have Central Avenue right here. St. Paul's over here. That's Central Street. St. Paul's over here. And that is Summerville going that way. But you see the little parcels as they started building out where new areas would be. All right. Notice that the land below and to the right is listed as swampland. See these swampland? That includes Azalea Park and Hutchinson Square. Those things were all underwater. That's why if you go upstairs in the museum, we have a paleontology room. All those dolphin bones and all those animal bones, marine animals, were found right here in Dorchester County because it was underwater for so long. Amazing, right? You don't think about that when you walk outside today, but it would have been underwater, all that area. Here's a little jewel I learned about recently. So this time period also grants me the first opportunity to discuss reasons for the diversity of many Summerville communities. And you'll note Dr. West kind of touched on this when he gave the introduction. Although I will discuss specific African American communities and what became New Summerville, we must remember that as early as 1825, many blacks were allowed to establish separate dwellings on the lands of their owners. Up to and following the Civil War, blacks lived among whites on their former owners' land all the way up to 1860. Following the Civil War, specifically from 1870 to 1880, virtually everybody in Summerville was broke. After the Civil War, when they got rid of slavery, some of South Carolina was like, we broke now. We can really tell our relatives we broke, because we are. Everybody lost everything after that. But owners felt an obligation to their former servants. So they allowed them to live in small houses on the property, and many of them never left. As you said, many of them never left. So you had that natural diversity of former owners and former servants living together, which was a beautiful thing, beautiful gesture. One example of post-Civil War neighborhoods I learned about was called Buttonsville. This was an area around Central Baptist Church, bordered by Congress Street, West Richardson, and Rutherford. That's the area within the circle there, all within the circle. In the middle of the old section of the original village of Summerville. According to Dr. West, these structures were probably built on land that was in the lower wetlands areas or simply in undesirable areas by people without much money. They may have had to fill the lots or drain them in order to build on those lots. The article you see here is about Mr. Buddy, who bought these houses and rented them out to African American families, thus the name Buttonsville. On this map of Summerville in 1934, you see how the railroad owners separated plots of land into blocks. You see that clearly by the red outline you see there. Each block equaled 4 acres and could contain 4 homes with accompanying outbuildings. This shows progress toward the Summerville we have today. The railroad owned everything below Main Street and to the right of the railroad tracks. That's everything within that red border area. It was not part of original Summerville, but belonged to the railroad company. This created 2 separate areas until the canals were completed around 1890 that allowed people to build on the former swampland. Yes, Hutchinson Square and the surrounding area, what became part of New Summerville, was underwater. These maps are just a reminder of how completely separated old Summerville and the railroad-owned areas were due to that large body of water. Until the canals and draining system that we spoke about last month, you might hear last month for the sawmill lecture? Yeah, that drainage that we talked about happened, and that's what enabled them to finally bring those 2 halves together. The map on the right shows plots of land that were either already sold or available to be purchased. Those in green were already sold. Those in red were available for you to buy. So they made it clear, we're going to make some money off of this land. When I turn my attention to ethnicity, I'm really answering that question, where and how did the black people live in Summerville, South Carolina during that time, all the way up through the 1970s. Dr. Ed West highlighted something that helped explain the early diversity of Summerville. As I said a little while ago, after the Civil War, most of the formerly enslaved remained on local plantations. My students have a hard time with this. They say, okay, the war's over, everybody ran north, right? No. Like, why not? Where's the north? What's there?
They were broke.
How we get there? Is there a job for me there? I got 10 kids. How we getting them there? So many of them said, we're going to stay right here, and we're going to work for old Massa Bob. He letting us stay here. He going to pay us to work the land like we did before. Many of them stayed right where they were. The majority of them stayed right where they were. There was not a mass exodus until you get into the Great Migration between 1910 and 1920, caused by Jim Crow and, more importantly, industrial opportunities in the North. During World War I, those factories needed workers. That's when you really had that mass exodus of folks leaving the South. I actually said I'm from Philly, but both my parents are from North Carolina. My slave ancestor, Levi Christmas Scarlett, cool name, right? Levi Christmas Scarlett, who was purchased by the Scarlett sisters in Durham, North Carolina. My cousin, who's a judge, She has the actual copy of the bill of sale when the sisters purchased Levi, helped them on the land. I ain't mad at them because they left them 150 acres of land, and I was down there to sell that land. So I'm like, way to go, Scarlett sisters. Appreciate y'all. And it's rare for us to know where our names come from. So my students find that story interesting, and I find it interesting when I finally learned that 15, 20 years ago, when that first came about. Okay, so in an article titled "History of Summerville," posted September 6, 1901, John Gadsden, the son of the founding father of Summerville, Reverend Philip Gadsden, discussed a census he and Samuel Tupper completed around 1858 to 1860 in the local newspaper. One of the teachers at my school is the great-great-grandson of John Gadsden. Yeah, keep trying to get Mr. Gadsden to come up here and talk at the museum because he has all that history, pictures, and everything. I'm like, bruh, come on up and share. He said, I'll get my dad to do it. My dad's the real historian. I've been saying that for the last 2 years. So maybe one day we can get him up here. Okay. So, where was I? Oh. In the article, he states, and I quote, "We lived like one household here. Everybody knew everybody else, from the heads of the households down to the infant Negro in the yard." He goes on to say, "We passed from residence to residence, noting down father, mother, number of children, etc. The old mama, housemaids, houseboy, cook, and family coachman, and his family, footboy, the old lamplighter, the yard sweeper, we knew every one of them." Whew. As indicative of the times, we mentioned that 50 colored people, old and young, were counted on one lot, as the whites numbered just 10. Each white might be said to have 5 colored attendants, and 60 persons in all, most of whom were black, lived on that 1 acre of land. The aggregate, he remembered, was 1,088 people in that town. That's a lot different from today, as Summerville has between 50 and 54,000 people today. Why is my focus on the black community? Simple. All the other ethnicities I learned about, including some black people, lived in uniquely diverse greater Summerville. A lot of the African Americans in Summerville settled here after leaving the 35th United States Colored Troops. As many of you know, and some don't know, the 35th United States Colored Troops were stationed in Summerville, South Carolina during the Civil War. And their final mustering station was here in Summerville. They rebuilt Bacon Bridge Road after the Civil War, after it had been destroyed during the war. They learned how to read and write here in Summerville. That's a whole other story. That's a separate lecture that we do about them. But no, they were very important people in this town. And it's kind of understandable why they were treated well by their leadership, taught how to read and write by the commander's wife, because the commander himself was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. You better know. Talking to my student. She's like, oh, actually we haven't gotten that part yet. You know. Another one of my students. Last year's student. Okay, so yeah, Harriet Beecher Stowe, writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, big abolitionist family. So it made sense that they treated their soldiers the way they did. But the point is that when they disbanded after the war, many of them settled right here in Summerville. Before I get into specifics, I want to answer the question more broadly by saying that the real answer to that question, with some limitations of where they lived in Summerville, was pretty much wherever they could afford to live. That turned out to be the real answer to that question. Simply put, I could not find any evidence of overt redlining, which was a historical practice where banks and real estate agents colluded to prevent African Americans from living in certain neighborhoods. You want to really see that in action, go look at historic Chicago. You talk about the South, look at Chicago. Massive redlining during the Civil Rights era. I also could not find well-defined lines. Like black folks could not live on a certain side of railroad tracks. You hear that sometimes. Folks from the other side of the tracks. No, just didn't seem to have that in Summerville. As one example, in the area where Central Baptist Church is today, whites and blacks live together in an area near West Richardson and Rutherford Street. Many blacks refer to that area as inside the curve. As I mentioned earlier, I can now also refer to this area as Buttonsville, a term I recently learned. In one location that was dominated by black residents, Orangeburg Road was called Red Road. It ran from Dorchester Road all the way past Berlin G. Myers Road up to where Summerville High School is. But when I asked Mr. Sinclair Mack if there were places black people could not go in Summerville in the late 1950s, his response was, I really couldn't answer that. There's no place we wanted to go. There was no place we tried to go. Okay, so he couldn't answer it. He did talk about the segregation of the Summerville movie theater, where blacks went upstairs, whites went downstairs, which is the same theater as James Dean Playhouse now in Summerville. That was the old segregated movie theater. Also, the fact that Timrod Library was for whites only. Blacks could not go to the library. What I did find that surprised me, although it really should not have, since I have seen this aspect of history repeated throughout the country, is the fact that black families own a significant amount of land in this city. Some families, like the descendants of Jordan Simmons, still own a significant amount of land in the area known as the Bay. What I do want to emphasize is the extreme amount of pride I sense from people telling me about their named communities. When I say named communities, that often refers to the names they gave the community, not something you will find anywhere on a map. Somerville contained a mixture of officially and unofficially named communities, like the Tracks, also known as Up the Tracks, Quarters, the Bay, Brownsville, Germantown, etc. And although not Summerville proper, we have Lincolnville. In case you don't know, there's a town founded by blacks after the Civil War. And you also have Cook's Crossroads that have significant histories for black and indigenous communities. These areas will be covered in later lectures, one specifically about Schutt's Plantation, black education, and Cook's Crossroads, and another about impactful residents of Summerville, like Saul Alexander, Dr. J.H. Alston, and Martin Lotz. So what I want y'all to start thinking about, so when this is over, email us or something, in your knowledge, who were the movers and shakers of Summerville, as far back as you can go? Who were the movers and shakers? Think about those names. You might sleep on it for a little bit. Send us a message as we are developing that as a future lecture. So I'll do my best to represent some of those communities today. Feel free to shout or interject when I mention your community. I started to bring boxing gloves, because just hang them right here. Because it kind of got heated with some of the discussions I was having with black folk in this town. No, he wrong. Oh, okay, sorry. I'll write that down too. Write your version and his version, right? So it got kind of interesting on some of those occasions. So before I go further, I want to personally acknowledge the work of fellow historians, like Rosie Gaiman, who has been writing a book on black life in Summerville, and has been sharing information with me for the last 3 years on that history. I also want to thank Wendell Nolan, who welcomed me into his home, allowed me to interview him for a couple of hours, even regaling me with some of the musical magic on his keyboards, and threatening to beat the pants off me on his pool table. Things you got to do for research. My most in-depth interview is with a man whose history goes back to the 1950s in Summerville. As I said, his name is Sinclair Mack, but he told me most people would refer to him as Bozo Mack, the ball player. None of this would have been possible without Ken Battle, member of this museum, who is the skeleton key to unlock a lot of doors of opportunity. Everybody I talked to, Ken put me in contact with. He knows a lot of people. I also want to acknowledge the use of the book, The History of Brownsville Community Church of God, that helped me understand the role of the church as underpinning not just Brownsville, but every community in Summerville. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Danny Hughes, who does everything for this museum, and Dr. Ed West. Dr. Ed West was the first person I turned to when I decided to create this discussion. And as always, he was the last person I asked to review the presentation to ensure that I was ready for the presentation today. So thank you, Dr. West, as always. And he's also working with me on these next 2 lectures and a few others. Right? All right, enough stalling. Here we go. I'm the messenger. Remember that, folks. I'm the messenger. Okay. When I started discussing the possibility of doing a lecture on African American communities in Summerville, every conversation started with Brownsville. Every conversation. In the book I mentioned about the Brownsville Community Church of God, you can clearly see how ingrained this community is in the history of Summerville. Specifically, the book says, from the early 1900s, the Church of God in Brownsville has grown spiritually and numerically. It also says, in the beginning, there were not many members who could read or write. The majority of the members were only the first generation out of slavery. Clearly, Brownsville has been around for a long time. But what actually designates Brownsville? This is where it gets controversial for some people. As with all communities I discussed today, it depends on who you ask. So when we look at the map, Brownsville was described to me as the area between Maple Street, Highway 78, Main Street, and First North Street around the Brownsville Church of God. Despite what we see here, I've gotten different versions of what to say about Brownsville. So I told them I'd say both. So I'm going to do that. One says Brownsville is considered the largest black neighborhood and is known as up the track by most, but you can't say that around somebody from Brownsville. I learned that. You cannot say that. They say, no, nothing to do with that. It's all just Brownsville. Don't call it anything else. Also said to contain sub-areas within Greater Brownsville area. We'll talk about some of that. The other description says that the major area represents up the tracks. And then Brownsville is part of that. Oh, you want to fight? Tell that to somebody from Brownsville. And they say up the tracks includes some of the smaller areas that we're going to discuss. It was my first interview. Mr. Wendell Nolan said Brownsville was the larger general area and included Pigeon Bay, which he referred to as the Bay. Also, it included Wassamassaw and Sugar Hill, but does not extend to the area known as the track, according to him. He said Brownsville children attended the Bank School, which later became the George Washington Carver Library. That was a school built for black children in the area, the Bank School. Also, he would go through Brownsville to get to St. Barnabas Mission, which was the primary source of aid for African Americans. Above Brownsville is Wassamassaw Road, considered a small community of its own. I learned that Wassamassaw, spelled backwards, is Wassamassaw. Useless note, but I found it interesting to learn that. This was considered part of the black community to many. Wassamassaw Road was considered the black road. Wassamassaw and Ridgeville also connected to the so-called Red School that supported indigent children of all ethnicities. The Bay goes from Industrial Road above Pine Forest, near Pine Forest Country Club. Today it features areas like the Bay Point at Summerville and Cedar Key Apartments. It runs along Pigeon Bay Road. According to Mr. Nolan, Parson Road and Maple Street used to be one road. Seems to be somewhat of a boundary from the start of the Bay. He says the Bay and Parson Road are together. Mr. Sinclair Mack mentioned that Parson Road was once known as Laura Falls Road. Makes me wonder about Mr. Mack, because he said that was important because she ran a corn liquor house. To some folks that have been very important, right? Much of this land is still owned by the descendants of Jordan Simmons, which includes Mr. Wendell Nolan, the man I interviewed. Pigeon Bay Road turns into Jordan Simmons Road in the Bay. Jordan Simmons, the grandfather of Mr. Wendell Nolan, was a man from the Bay who had the determination necessary to be accepted into the Tuskegee Institute to gain his technical degree. He brought that knowledge back to work in the local community, and according to Mr. Mack, he was best known as a brick mason. And I asked Wendell about that, probably argued, anyway, they argue about everything. Okay, according to my research, the area called the track, or up the track, was named because it started near the railroad track around West Dottie Avenue and Maple Street. Once you get to Bryan Street, the track becomes Sugar Hill, between Bryan Street and the railroad track. According to former resident and aspiring author Rosie Gayman, Sugar Hill would be second in size to Up the Track, or the Brownsville section within the city limits. The main corridor of Sugar Hill is West 2nd North Street, and it's 4 square blocks running east from Bryan Street on both sides of Hickory Street. Mr. Gayman says Sugar Hill contained 2 quarters. They were Simmons Quarters and Myers Quarters that were separated by Palmetto Street and 2 lots running along the main corridor. Sugar Hill neighborhood also included the square section beyond Hickory Street on the north side of West 2nd North Street. Albert Glover's funeral home on Bryan Street marks the start of Sugar Hill, also known as the Hill. According to Dr. West, Rollins Edwards lived in Sugar Hill, which also features the parchment for Wesley Church. Now I gotta admit, Dr. West, I didn't understand what that meant. What do you mean by the parchment for Wesley Church?
I'm sorry, say it
The
again.
parchment for Wesley Church. I'll ask you later, you're thinking too hard. See the steam. I'll ask you later. So I was confused by that, but I wanted to get some clarification. All right, so my next area, the quarters. The quarters is not an area in and of itself. The quarters was a series of areas, places where black people used to rent these really small houses. Where KFC is in downtown Summerville now, that's where Simmons Quarters used to be, by Aiken's Funeral Home. According to Sinclair Mack, they were called quarters because during World War II, they had houses where soldiers would live. He said there were 2 black families who lived on the front of the street, the Reed family and the Taps family. The Taps family home was where KFC is today. This also included other black families, the Jones family, the Ankrum family, and the Pedro family. Pedro family apparently opened a black-owned soda shop to provide a safe place for black teenagers to hang out. When asked about Myers Quarters, he said the Myers lived uptown, which was near Central Church or Sassport's lot. Other quarters were located in Brownsville between West 2nd North Street, North Hickory Street, West 1st North Street, and North Palmetto Street. We tried to be as precise as we could. Another could be found to the left of Brownsville Church of God around North Maple Street, West Luke Avenue, and West 1st North Street, near the current location of the fire department, and near Trident United Way for Strong Families on Rivers Avenue. Last specific area I wish to discuss is Germantown, basically downtown Summerville. Above the intersection of Sumter Avenue and Southampton Street, this includes 2 sections within Summerville, Germantown and Atlantic Street. Simmons Avenue is considered the beginning of Germantown. The black section was basically between Simmons Avenue, Waring Street, Lowndes Lane, and Shepherd Avenue. According to Dr. West, several black families used to live south of Sumter Avenue, which included the area around Wesley Methodist Church. The Pine Forest Inn was in Germantown, by President Street. Also, both Saul Alexander and Kitty Springs used to own stores in the Germantown area in Hutchinson Square. You know how you walk past something 100 times and not realize that you walked past history? I was blown away to learn that every third Thursday, as I stand in the Summerville Museum booth, if you never came out the third Thursday, come on out. Good food, good people, meet your neighbors. It's a good occasion. Every third Thursday at night, right there in Hutchinson Square. But I didn't realize that I was actually standing within feet of Summerville's old theater built specifically for African Americans. The Blacks Owned Theater is right there in Hutchinson Square. In case you had no idea, no, it's not where the James Dean Theater is now. That was the racially segregated movie theater where blacks had to sit up in the balcony. What is now the beautiful Cyril and Methodius Russian Orthodox Church in Hutchinson Square was the old blacks movie theater. I never knew that. Think about walking through and you got that gate, that little church right there, all decorated. And you look down the hallway, it goes way in the back, in there. That was the entrance to the Blacks Only movie theater. See, I was not the only one that didn't know. There are a lot of out there. It's an education great. Love to learn things. So, what is now, well, I already said that. So, Russian Orthodox Church, Hudson Square. I think that is extremely appropriate because black folks only made it through the grace of God. So it's appropriate that it's a church now. I also want to give honorable mention to an area called Red Hill. During the U.S. Civil War, the 35th United States Colors Troop Regiment, under the command of Colonel James Chaplain Beecher, camped on the Pineland Ridge. This area was also called the Barracks, according to the book Recollection of Summerville, South Carolina, by George I. Judkinson. I want to switch gears a little away from specific neighborhoods to how people lived and played in Summerville. So let's talk about the churches that held the community together, and finally where they played as children and as adults. Now I'm not going to go into detail on these churches. Thank you, Dr. West. You don't know how timely your introduction to these churches actually were. So I'm sitting there going, that's so cool, perfect. Because I'm not going to go into detail. But what does this represent? What you see here is a list of the churches shared with me by the four main people I interviewed for the talk. It clearly does not show all the significant churches connected to Summerville. But for different reasons, they stand out in the minds of those that I interviewed. The two churches deemed most significant for this talk are St. Paul's Church, which serves as the unofficial boundary between Old and New Summerville, and Brownsville Church of God, which serves as an unofficial boundary between the largest historically African American communities and mostly New Summerville. When I first asked Sinclair Mack what they did for fun, he said there was not much to do in Summerville, because during the week, everything was closed after 5 p.m. But on Saturday, all of the farmers would come into town. So everybody you didn't get to see in school, this included white friends, since the schools were segregated, you would see on Saturday at the farmer's market. Anybody remember those old markets? A lot of young folk in here. For eating places, when I got really, oh no, let me go back a little bit. When I persisted, I got a list of places from Mr. Mack and from Window Nova. That included, and first we talked about eating places, they talked about two significant ones. Said there was only two main eating places. Eva's Restaurant, listed online as Eva's on the Main. It was owned by a white couple, Eva Henson and her husband. When her husband decided the restaurant business was not for him, Eva took full control and named it Eva's and ran it for many years. And Anna Helen Jenkins Kitchen, AKA Anna Helen's Cafe, owned by a black woman. Another example of Summerville's greatness, where females could run their own businesses back in the 1950s. When it came to socializing and partying, you had, number one, the Duck Inn. Up the track, somebody recognize that. Mr. Mack said they hung out there big time. It was located where the industrial area is, just past Highway 78 and North Maple in Wassamasaw. Second was KP Hall nightclub, near the old town hall. According to Wendell Nolan, KP Hall was an example of discrimination within an ethnic group. Light-skinned blacks were only allowed to attend on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now I can relate to that because my mama was light, bright, damn near white. That's the phrase we used to use. And we did her DNA, she's 48% African. Like, Mom, you're a white chick. Explains why she couldn't dance. But yeah, that was very interesting to learn. But he said this continued until a dark-skinned man nicknamed Blackjack came to town, bringing women of all complexions and ethnicities to the club, and no one dared to challenge him. Mr. Nolan says Cedar Avenue, near Central Avenue, used to be titled Blackjack Street. And the old maps prove that that's true. You look at that old railroad map, it has Blackjack Street. Right there with Cedar Avenue. So I found that fascinating to see that on the map. In addition, it said whites avoided that area and the club. One of the reasons these places existed was because black residents could not attend the white clubs. And then we talked about black nightclubs in Germantown specifically. According to Mr. Nolan and Mr. Mack, they included two. The 5220 Club, which is one of my favorite names now, because the club got its name from its owner. When the owner left the military, his final check was $52.20. And he sunk it all into a club. I mean, that's a man forward thinking, right? Man after your heart, right, Joe? Man after your heart, independent business owner. That's great. Right? And the other club was called the Many Faces Club. He emphasized that all the property in that area was black owned. I want to close with a historically significant relationship that was true in Summerville and throughout the tumultuous Jim Crow era in America. And that is the relationship between African Americans and their Jewish neighbors. The Jewish community in Summerville was especially helpful. Saul Alexander hired and trained black youth to work in his stores. In addition, he gave the black community a playground in the Wassamasaw area and the black movie theater in Hutchinson Square. The Jewish community was wealthy, owned a lot of property, and assisted the black community. People like Spencer Lynch and his family assisted black residents in their quest to own businesses in the short central area, generally centered around Central Avenue and West Richardson Avenue, with Hutchinson Square as the main hub. We here at the Summerville Museum and Research Center also benefit directly from the Lynch Foundation, who provided the funds for us to restore the Saul Alexander Garden House, which sits right on the other side of this wall, in our garden today. It is considered very fair to say that the Jewish community of Summerville has always been a great friend of the black community and all communities throughout Summerville. They provided opportunities many may not have ever had, including making it financially manageable for African Americans to own their own businesses in Summerville. It is believed that the Jewish community felt a kinship with the suffering of the black community that soon after World War II. Mr. Sinclair Mack used Harriet Tubman to make an excellent point. He said, you know, Harriet Tubman did not own any land, but she was able to use numerous houses to get her escapees from the South all the way to Canada. And that was only possible because of the white owners of those homes that were willing to help her out. My students are surprised when I tell them that the majority of the abolitionists, the majority of the Underground Railroad, and even the majority of the NAACP were whites. So you could not categorize good blacks, bad whites. No. These successes would not have been possible without white abolitionists and other white supporters during that time. You find that very present here in Summerville as well. He said it was the same in Summerville. As an example, he mentioned the fact that blacks could not use the public library. But there was a white doctor named Dr. Tupper and a man named Joe Melfi. Those two ran a doctor's office and pharmacy called Tupper Drugstore, where they opened up a common book reading area where all kids could come and read comic books. Mr. Mack emphasized that white and black children covered the benches and floor of that reading area together. To me, that is Summerville in a nutshell. Existing in a harsh world, but managing to show unusual kindness and brotherhood.